There's a particular kind of quiet that settles in after you've finally stopped waiting for someone to acknowledge what they did. It's not peace, exactly. It's something heavier than that. Something that sits in the chest and asks you to make sense of experiences you never fully understood while you were inside them. If you've found yourself in that quiet lately, if you've been replaying moments and wondering whether you were seen, whether any of it registered, whether they ever truly grasped the weight of what they put you through, then this reading found you at exactly the right moment. Because the energy around this situation is dense tonight. And it has a lot to say. Let me just sit with this for a moment before I dive in. There's something almost muffled about the energy I'm feeling around whoever this is about. Like a conversation that kept happening in half sentences. Like two people who were in the same space but living in entirely different emotional realities. And I want you to notice that, because it's important. The disconnection here wasn't just about circumstances or timing. It was about the space between what was felt and what was expressed. And for a long time, that silence became its own kind of language, except it was a language that only one of you was being asked to interpret alone. That person was you. There's this feeling I keep getting of someone giving, and adjusting, and softening their edges, and waiting, genuinely, patiently waiting, for the other person to show up in a way that matched the care that was being offered. And the frustrating thing, the part that probably stayed with you long after other things faded, was that it wasn't that this other person was incapable. It's that they were choosing, in ways both conscious and unconscious, not to show up. And somewhere inside you, you sensed that. You knew. Even when you were giving them the benefit of the doubt, something quieter in you knew. You're not imagining that knowing. It was real. What I'm picking up on first is this deep, almost eerie silence that existed in a relationship at an emotional level. And I don't mean silence like peaceful stillness. I mean silence like withheld words. Like conversations that never fully happened. Like questions you carried inside yourself for weeks or months, maybe about where you stood, maybe about whether you mattered, maybe about why certain things kept being avoided, and you could never quite get a real answer. The emotional language between you felt muted. Suppressed. And I think a part of you spent a significant amount of energy trying to read between lines that shouldn't have been that complicated. Does this feel familiar? The sensation of reaching out and being met with just enough warmth to keep you from walking away, just enough presence to make you second-guess your concerns, but never quite enough to make you feel genuinely held? Because that's the dynamic I'm seeing. And it's subtle. It's the kind of thing that's hard to explain to people on the outside. Hard to articulate why it hurt as much as it did when you couldn't always point to one dramatic moment and say that's when it broke. It was cumulative. It was the accumulation of small absences. Small silences. Small dismissals. And those things, over time, do something to a person's sense of self. They make you question whether your emotional needs are too large. Whether you're too sensitive. Whether you're asking for too much. You weren't asking for too much. You were asking for what any person deserves. Now here's where the energy starts to shift a little, and I find this interesting. Because while your experience of this dynamic was real and valid and ongoing, there was a part of this person who was running from themselves. And I want to be careful how I say this because I'm not offering this as an excuse. What this person did, the emotional neglect they participated in, the way they allowed you to feel unseen and unacknowledged, that's theirs to carry. That's not something you caused or could have prevented by being different or smaller or more accommodating. But what I'm sensing is that there was, underneath their behavior, a very specific kind of internal chaos that they kept hidden from you. This is someone who didn't fully want to look at themselves. There are people who move through relationships in a kind of half-present state, not because they don't care at all, but because genuine emotional intimacy requires a level of self-awareness they haven't yet developed. And sometimes, those people use distance, emotional distance, conversational distance, the strategic deployment of silence, not as cruelty, though it functions that way, but as self-protection. They've learned, somewhere along the way, that staying on the surface is safer. That acknowledging another person's pain means having to acknowledge their own role in creating it. And that's terrifying when you haven't built the internal capacity to sit with that. This is interesting, because what I'm seeing is that they told themselves a story. For a long time, they told themselves a story about this situation that allowed them to remain comfortable. Maybe they minimized what happened. Maybe they reframed your hurt as oversensitivity. Maybe they convinced themselves that because they didn't intend harm, harm wasn't done. People are extraordinary at that. The mind's ability to protect itself from guilt is almost architectural in its sophistication. But something has been cracking through that story. There's a harshness to the energy I'm sensing on their side now. Like something broke through the surface that they weren't prepared for. And this doesn't feel like a small reckoning. This feels like the kind of moment that arrives when reality can no longer be softened by the narratives we tell ourselves. Something happened, or is happening, that has forced this person to look. Actually look. At what they did. At how they behaved. At the gap between who they believed themselves to be and who they actually were in relation to you. I want to be honest with you, this wasn't a gentle realization for them. The energy around this feels almost disorienting for them. Like they've pulled back a curtain they'd grown very comfortable keeping closed and found something there they weren't expecting. The full scale of their actions is landing in a way that their previous self-understanding couldn't accommodate. And there's shame in that. Genuine shame. Not the performative kind, not the kind that immediately asks for reassurance or forgiveness. The quieter, more private kind that sits with a person in the moments when they're alone with themselves and can't run from what they know. Some of you may be realizing that this is actually significant. Because for someone who built such careful walls around their emotional accountability, this kind of internal reckoning is not small. This doesn't fix what happened. I want to be clear about that. It doesn't reach backward and undo the silence, or the neglect, or the way you were left to hold yourself through things you shouldn't have had to hold alone. It doesn't give back what was withheld. But it does tell us something about where this person is now, and about the energy that exists around them in relation to you. There's a heaviness around them that I keep coming back to. It feels like regret, but it's not the kind of regret that's fresh or fleeting. This has weight to it. This feels like something they've been carrying without knowing how to put it down. And I think part of what makes it so heavy is the realization not just of what they did, but of how long they did it. The duration. The ongoing nature of the emotional neglect, the way it repeated itself across time and across different moments that should have been handled differently. When someone truly starts to reckon with that, there's a very particular feeling that comes with it. It's not just, I was wrong in this one moment. It's the cascading recognition of pattern. The way one behavior connects to another and then another. The way small dismissals add up. The way choosing comfort over honesty becomes a habit, and then a character trait, and then a source of damage to someone you presumably cared about on some level. I'm hearing something like an internal voice that keeps returning to specific moments. Like scenes they can't stop replaying. Not your pain directly, but specific instances where they know, now, they should have done something different. Should have said something. Should have stayed instead of deflecting. Should have asked how you were and actually meant it. That replaying, that's not comfortable for them. That's the energy of someone who is genuinely grappling with what they were capable of. Now I want to talk about you for a moment, because this reading isn't just about them. There's an emotional residue that I'm sensing around you that I want to name carefully. Because even if you've reached a place of distance from this person, even if you've processed much of what happened, there may still be this quiet, unanswered part of you that wanted acknowledgement. Not necessarily a conversation. Not necessarily a formal apology, though perhaps that too. But just acknowledgement. The feeling of being seen in your hurt. Of having someone say, yes, I know. Yes, I understand. Yes, I see what I did. That desire is not weakness. It's the most human thing in the world. We are wired to need our experiences reflected back to us, especially when they involve pain caused by another person's choices. When that reflection never comes, something stays open. Not necessarily broken open, but unresolved. Like a question you never got to finish asking. Have you noticed how much energy it took, over time, just to keep interpreting them? Just to keep giving the benefit of the doubt, keep recalibrating your expectations, keep finding ways to make sense of behavior that honestly shouldn't have required so much interpretation? This feels like someone who gave far more than they received. Someone whose emotional labor was constant and largely invisible. Someone who, in trying to preserve something that mattered to them, absorbed more than they should have ever had to absorb. And there's something I want to say to that part of you very directly. The fact that you cared that much was not the problem. The fact that you tried was not the problem. The capacity you showed, the patience you extended, the grace you offered even when it wasn't being matched, those things speak to something genuinely beautiful in you. And they were not wasted, even when they went unmet. They were an expression of who you are. And who you are was never the issue. The energy changes here. Because what I'm sensing now is something that feels like a delay that's finally ending. Like a slow dawn. Like something that has been stuck in place just beginning, to move. And I want to be careful not to overpromise on what that means, because the cards here aren't telling me to give you a simple, they're coming back or everything will resolve type of message. That's not what this energy feels like. What it feels like is understanding. Delayed understanding. The kind that arrives too slowly to be useful in the moment, but arrives nonetheless. And there's something meaningful about that arrival, even when it's late. Because this person is reaching a comprehension they didn't previously have access to, whether because they weren't ready, weren't willing, or hadn't yet been stripped of the defenses that were keeping them from it. There's more to this than it first appeared. Because this understanding, this recognition they're moving through, it's not just intellectual. It's not just, I know I hurt you. It's deeper than that. It's a genuine emotional grasp of what your experience was like. And that's different. That's harder to come by and harder to dismiss. When someone arrives at genuine empathy for another person's pain, rather than just a logical understanding of it, something shifts at a core level. Something they can't unknow. Whether that leads to action, whether that leads to something meaningful between you or simply to their own private growth, that remains to be seen. But the recognition is real. And I think a part of you has always wanted to know that it was real. That they weren't entirely immune to the weight of what happened between you. They weren't. I want to bring in something that keeps coming up energetically, this image of a mirror. Of someone being forced to see themselves clearly. And the reason this feels significant is because so much of what this person did, the emotional absence, the looking away, the choosing of their own comfort over your reality, it was rooted in an inability to face their own reflection. When we avoid accountability, we are almost always also avoiding something about ourselves we find too difficult to hold. But mirrors have a way of finding us. Life has a way of positioning them in front of us whether we're ready or not. And what I'm seeing for this person is that they're standing in front of that mirror now. And it's not comfortable. It's actually quite destabilizing. Because when the image of yourself that you've been carefully curating suddenly no longer holds, when the story collapses under the weight of what you know you actually did, you have to rebuild from somewhere more honest. And that process, for them, is actively underway. There's shame in that mirror. There's discomfort. There's probably some avoidance still, because old patterns don't disappear the moment insight arrives, but there's also something that feels like the beginning of real accountability. Not performed accountability. Not the kind designed to get something from you. The kind that happens quietly, internally, with no audience. Take what resonates here, because this collective energy will touch different people in different ways. But for those of you who've been quietly wondering whether any of this ever landed for the other person, I believe it has. I believe it's landing now in ways they couldn't allow before. This is interesting, because the energy around this doesn't feel static. It has direction to it. Like something that has been developing behind the scenes, slowly, and is now approaching a kind of threshold. For some of you, that may manifest as a reaching out. A message, a gesture, some attempt at contact that carries a different quality than before. Whether you engage with that or not is entirely your choice, and this reading is not here to tell you what that choice should be. What matters is that you enter whatever comes next with your eyes open and your own needs clearly in your awareness. Because you spent long enough prioritizing what they needed. You spent long enough calibrating yourself to their comfort. Whatever chapter comes next, it begins with what you need. For others of you, the movement in this energy might not take external form at all. It might simply be a quiet internal shift. A release of the question you've been carrying. A settling into the knowledge that yes, they understand now, even if that understanding arrives without a conversation or a reconciliation. Sometimes closure doesn't come in the form we expect it. Sometimes it arrives as simply an internal recognition that the story has been seen, on both sides, for what it truly was. And that can be enough. That can be genuinely enough. At first this looked like a story about something broken. But looking deeper, it feels more like a story about something finally being made clear. Like the truth of this situation, all of it, the neglect, the silence, the weight that was placed on you, the awakening happening now on their side, is rising to the surface with a kind of inevitability. Like it always was going to. Like the clarity was always going to arrive, even if the timeline wasn't what you would have chosen. I want to speak to something very specifically before we close. If you have been carrying guilt about your own reactions during this time, I want to address that. If you pulled away, if you got frustrated, if you eventually hardened or shut down or said things out of pain that you're not entirely proud of, please hear this, your responses were human. They were the natural responses of someone who was not getting what they needed. People in emotional deficit react. People who feel unseen become loud, or they go quiet, or they swing between both. Whatever you did in response to the conditions of this dynamic, it came from somewhere real. It came from a place of genuine pain and unmet need. That doesn't mean every response was handled perfectly. It means it was human. It means context matters. And the context here is that you were operating inside an emotionally depleted dynamic for a long time, and you did the best you could with what you had. Be patient with yourself about that. The energy settles here, slowly. Like the tide going out after something has been said. There's a quietness to where this reading lands that feels intentional. Like the universe is asking you to rest in what you know, rather than chase after what you don't. What you know is this, you weren't wrong in what you felt. You weren't overreacting. You weren't asking for too much. The experience you had was real, and its impact on you was valid, and the recognition, whether you ever hear it spoken aloud or simply sense it in the shifting energy around this person, is coming. In some ways, it's already here. You don't have to wait for their acknowledgement to move forward. You don't have to hold your own healing in place while you hope for them to say the right words. The validation you deserve doesn't have to come from them. It already lives in the fact that you knew the truth of your experience all along, even when it was being quietly denied. That inner knowing was always your compass. Trust it now. There's something I keep wanting to say as we reach the end of this, and it's simply this: the period of being overlooked is behind you. Whether or not you stay connected to this person in any form, the energetic chapter defined by your needs going unmet, by your presence going undervalued, by your emotional world being treated as secondary, that chapter is closing. What comes next carries a different quality. A different weight. Something more solid underfoot. You have done the harder internal work. You have sat with the discomfort, you have asked yourself the difficult questions, you have stayed honest with yourself even when honesty was painful. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. That's the foundation that's going to carry you into whatever comes next.